We've reached the year 1938, which, for all intents and purposes, is the beginning of the end, or the end of the interwar years of the 20th century, and the coming of World War II. And 1938 was marked by a crisis in Europe. And from the very outset of that crisis, Ukrainian inhabited territories were involved in developments that would lead to the outbreak of the continent's, in a sense, as someone said, second great civil war in the course of the 20th century. And the first of these Ukrainian, or as we've just seen last time, Ruthenian inhabited territories was Transcarpathia. And that is because it was part of Czechoslovakia, a country upon which the new rising dominant continental power, Nazi Germany, had territorial designs. Now, the coming of World War II seems inevitable, not only to those of us living today. We have the benefit of historical hindsight, but also, in a sense, Europeans themselves had this deep-seated feeling that things weren't going to last, and things weren't going to last because the treaties that were associated with the Paris Peace Conference, which recreated Europe, as we see on this colored map. In one sense, they were punitive measures directed against those empires which had been on the losing side during World War I, that is the German Empire, the Austrian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was deprived of its non-Turkish inhabited areas, but it continued to exist, at least in a sense, in the form of a new state, Turkey. Austria-Hungary, of course, ceased to exist entirely. The other two, Germany and one portion of old Austria-Hungary, that is the Hungarian state that was left over from the Habsburg Empire, both Germany and Hungary felt that their national territory and abilities to function as viable states were seriously impaired by the peace treaties. In the case of Hungary, 2/3 of the old Hungarian kingdom were effectively lopped off by the treaties, in particular from the Hungarian point of view, the Treaty of Trianon in 1920. We hear about this treaty from time to time. If you follow the news carefully, the one ornery state in present-day European Union, which is Hungary, led by Viktor Orban, very often plays into the hands of right-wing, extreme right-wing politicians in Hungary, and sometimes sports in this case at a football game, a scarf which shows the old Hungarian kingdom before World War I. Well, this causes a little bit of problems with some other European allies, in particular Slovakia and in particular Romania, let alone Ukraine. So Hungary felt forever, and certainly during this period, the interwar period, that Trianon was disastrous for them, leaving large Magyar or Hungarian minorities in neighboring Czechoslovakia, in Romania, in Yugoslavia, even small chunk of land that Austria got from the old Hungarian kingdom. Germany, for its part, had lost the industrialized provinces of Alsace-Lorraine to France, and some territory to Belgium and to Poland in the east. But most detrimental from the standpoint of Berlin was the fact that it was saddled with large war reparations, and the occupation of its own rich industrial Ruhr area in the western part of the country that was taken over by French troops. So this is the kind of context that we have, certainly when we reach the 1930s. And as a result, during those 1930s, the revision of the post-World War I treaties became the primary goal of Germany, of Hungary, and to a lesser degree Italy, because Italy was also displeased with the fact that it did not get territory that it had hoped to get from the eastern coast of the Adriatic Sea, which was given to the new state of Yugoslavia as a result of the Paris Peace Conference. And so before long, the 19th century system of alliances based on power politics was now reactivated. Germany was the most important element in this scenario, and under its new leader, Chancellor Adolf Hitler, who came to power in 1933, that country soon came to lead those states who favored a revision of the existing territorial order that was created by the Paris Peace Conference in 1919-1920. Key figure here, of course, is this Adolf Hitler. He attains power in Germany, not through revolution, but rather as the leader of the National Socialist Party, the National Socialist Party, otherwise known by its acronym, the Nazi Party. And it had come to play a leading role in German politics by the late 1920s, and as a result, Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany in January 1933. 2 months later, his party, the Nazi Party, won a slight majority in the elections to the parliament. And almost immediately, in this case March 27th, Hitler claimed for himself dictatorial powers, didn't waste time. And he set Germany upon a new course, making use of the then modern totalitarian political techniques, flying around on a plane, using large radio broadcasts and public rallies, masterful use of demagoguery. He was a brilliant speaker, actually, terrible writer. Hitler and his Nazi supporters proceeded to eliminate, through intimidation and often brutal methods, all political opposition. So, for instance, the traditional elements of local German autonomous federalism. Germany still had all of these little states and traditions of them. They still existed, were now abolished. The goal of centralization. The German press and arts were placed under strict controls, and the already well-developed Nazi theory of racial superiority was implemented, its primary target being the Jews, who were stripped of their citizenship in 1935 and placed under increasingly severe legal and socioeconomic restrictions. And so within a few years of his coming to power in 1933, Germany's new leader, the Führer, which simply means in German leader, within those few years he had become the undisputed dictator of the country. Hitler promised to build another German empire. That was the medieval Holy Roman Empire, which we call Holy Roman, but in German it's called the Holy German Empire. And then the success of the Second Empire was the Hohenzollerns in the second half of the 19th century. Now, a third was going to be built, and this one, however, was to last 1,000 years, which is one of his popular phrases. German rearmament began. Hitler also sought new allies. With Mussolini's fascist Italy, he signed an alliance, which came to be known as the Rome-Berlin Axis, and hence we subsequently have these Axis powers, 1936. With Spain's fascist leader, General Franco, he provided aid during that country's civil war against the Republicans, pro-Franco. And outside of Europe, he signed an alliance with Japan that was specifically directed against the communist Soviet Union. And so by 1938, this year that we are speaking about, the year of crisis, Hitler was ready to push for revision regarding his own country's borders. And he couched those demands behind the slogan of unification of all ethnic Germans, which are known as Volksdeutsche. That is, Germans who lived outside a German state, traditionally throughout Central Europe and Eastern Europe, going back at least, well, going back to the medieval period, and then reiterated in the late 18th and 19th century. German settlements, ethnic Germans lived they were invited to settle by these countries. So the Germans all over into Ukraine, in the center of Ukraine. And as part of this policy of now uniting all of these ethnic Germans, Hitler turned first to German-speaking Austria, of which he was a subject. He was born a subject of Franz Joseph, by the way. An empire that he detested because it had allowed all these dastardly Slavs into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which should have been a pure German state. And so in March 1938, Nazi Germany annexes Austria. Obviously, a clear violation of the Paris Peace Conference, specifically the Treaty of Versailles. Not without the cooperation of pro-Nazi elements within Austria itself. That was March 1938. Hitler's next move was directed against Czechoslovakia, which in the German dictator's colorful phrase, because he was ramping up his rhetoric that this dastardly Czechoslovakia is like an arrow pointed at the heart of Germany. Well, all along the edges of this so-called dagger lived a German minority all along the edges here of the two western provinces of the country, Bohemia and Moravia Silesia, where as many as 3.2 million, quite large, quote-unquote minority, and they had been living there ever since the Middle Ages, by the way. And so the unification of these, what are known as Sudeten Germans, from the name of one mountain chain, Sudeten Germans, the unification of these Sudeten Germans now became his major goal. But in contrast to Austria, the government of democratic Czechoslovakia, officially a Slavic state, as we saw last time, was opposed to any designs on its territory. And Czechoslovakia did have allies in Britain and in France who, ever since the Paris Peace Conference in 1919, had considered this new state and gave support to it as part of a buffer against German expansion in the East. By the way, the Soviet Union was also allied with Czechoslovakia as part of its own mutual defense pact with France, because the Soviet Union had a mutual defense pact with France, which in turn had a treaty with Czechoslovakia. And knowing this, Hitler prevailed on British and French leaders to join him, together with his Italian ally Mussolini, to discuss what he now referred to as the Czechoslovak crisis. You declare that there's a crisis, and then you create it. And this is what he did. And so the leaders of Britain, France, Italy, and Nazi Germany met on September 28th, 29th, 1938, last days of September 1938, in the historic Bavarian city of Munich. Down here in Germany. And the result was the infamous Munich Pact of September 30th, 1938. Czechoslovakia's allies, France and Britain, agreed. By the way, Czechoslovakia was not even invited to this. And both the French and British prime ministers agreed to Germany's demand for acquisition of this German-inhabited Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia's western provinces of Bohemia and Moravia. What was left then of Czechoslovakia came to be called a rump state, because a lot of territory was lopped off here. So there's the Czechoslovakia is left in the middle. And it was also transformed as a result into a federal republic. So it was a centralized state, now it's a federal republic. And that meant that the republic's two eastern provinces, Slovakia and Subcarpathian Rus, we're getting closer to our story, they were now finally granted the long-awaited autonomy that they had wanted throughout the entire interwar years, not only Subcarpathian Rus, but also Slovakia, and they got it during the first week of October. So by the fall of 1938, Hitler's remarkable success in consolidating his own authority within Germany and in obtaining his initial foreign policy goals against France, Austria, and Czechoslovakia without even firing a shot, convinced many people, especially in Central and Southern Europe, that the German political model, with its authoritarian fascist system led by a supreme leader, the Führer, was the political wave of the future. And so one by one, most of those Central and Eastern European countries, some Western ones as well, whether or not they were allies of Germany, had become one-party national dictatorships led by a Hitler-like leader. Now, as I said, in terms of power politics, Germany was allied with Italy, with Spain, and those Central and Eastern European states like Hungary, also Bulgaria, and Turkey, all of whom favored territorial revision, all of whom were displeased with the order of the Paris Peace Conference. On the other hand, Germany was opposed by Britain, France, and their allies in Eastern Europe, Poland, Czechoslovakia, and Yugoslavia, all of whom hoped to maintain as long as possible the territorial status quo. As for the Soviet Union, it had that mutual defense treaty with France, although Germany's success in foreign affairs led, as we shall see, to a desire on the part of the leader of the Soviet Union, Stalin, to reach some kind of accord with Hitler. We'll get to that in a moment. But among Germany's European allies, it was Hungary that was to reap the first rewards. A little more than a month after the Munich Pact, at the end of September, the first days in November, another conference was held, this time in Vienna, which resulted in the further dismemberment of this rump state of Czechoslovakia. Hungarians wanted much of Slovakia, and they wanted all of Subcarpathian Rus, but at this Vienna conference of November 2nd, Hungary was only granted the southern portions of Slovakia and the southern portions of Subcarpathian Rus, that is, those areas in which the Hungarian minority was strongest, sort of like the Sudeten lands, and then we have these southern portions of Slovakia and Subcarpathian Rus. And aside from that, in the case of Subcarpathian Rus, and we can see this white area down here, they got the two cities of Uzhhorod and Mukachevo, which were the main cities in Subcarpathian Rus. And as for then the rest of this Transcarpathia or Subcarpathian Rus, it functioned, like Slovakia, as an autonomous unit within this smaller rump Czechoslovak Republic. Subcarpathia's first cabinet, appointed by the central government in Prague, according to recommendations by local leaders, was headed by a man named Andryi Bródyi, who was a Russophile in orientation. We know that in Subcarpathian Rus you had these different nationality orientations, or national orientations. So it was first the Russophiles that came to power. But then within 2 weeks it was discovered that this Bródyi was working on behalf of the Hungarians. He was arrested, and so the Czechoslovak government turned to the Ukrainophiles, and a new cabinet was formed, headed by the respected cultural and civic activist, the Greek Catholic priest, Avgustyn Voloshyn. And together with another important Ukrainophile activist, Iuliian Revai. After losing its provincial capital Uzhhorod and the other Hungarian inhabited regions to the south as a result of the Vienna Award, the capital, now the center of Carpatho-Ukraine, was moved eastward to a little town called Khust. Khust. The region now under the Voloshyn Ukrainophile regime was renamed Carpatho-Ukraine. Carpatho-Ukraine. Ukrainian was made the official language in government and education, so kind of resolved that language question. Plans were made to hold elections to an autonomous diet, which had been the demand going way back throughout the entire interwar years, and to protect itself from the continuing guerrilla attacks by Hungarian irregular troops from the south, as well as their Polish allies from the north. The Carpatho-Ukrainian government authorized in November the creation of a paramilitary force called the Carpathian Sich. The Carpathian Sich. It was headed by local Ukrainophile-oriented Subcarpathians, but most of the troops that were in it, about 2,000, were actually Galician Ukrainians from Galicia, neighboring Galicia, who crossed over the mountains from their standpoint to help protect this small autonomous territory. In fact, during its few months of autonomous existence in late 1938, early 1939, not only the Ukrainians in neighboring Polish-ruled Galicia, also large émigré circles in Central Europe, whether in Prague or in Vienna, also in North America, both in the United States and Canada, Ukrainian immigration, all thought that this minuscule Carpatho-Ukraine would become the Piedmont, that is a stepping stone from which an independent and united Ukrainian state would evolve. These ideas were even considered in some Nazi German circles. Authorities in Berlin, for its own reasons, hoped to use the Ukrainian issue to undermine its Soviet enemy farther east. Hitler's government even maintained a consulate in this little town of Khust and signed economic agreements with this new Carpatho-Ukraine. But in the end, Hitler had more grandiose plans for Eastern Europe, and this Carpatho-Ukraine was just simply too uninfluential to be part of those plans. And so in March 1939, when Hitler decided to just simply liquidate what remained of this rump Czechoslovakia, Carpatho-Ukraine's brief experiment with autonomy would be sacrificed to the larger German interests. By the way, the previous month in February, the Carpatho-Ukrainians did in fact elect an autonomous diet, which they had planned to, but it turned out that the region's days were numbered. On March 14, 1939, German troops marched into Prague, the capital of Czechoslovakia, and this rump state now ceased to exist. He annexed Bohemia and Moravia to, from his perspective, German lands anyway, to Germany. As for Slovakia, autonomous Slovakia, he gave the Slovaks a choice. They could be annexed to Hungary, which is what Hungary wanted, his allies, or they could declare an independent Slovakia as a German client state. Well, with this choice, not surprisingly, the Slovaks chose the latter option and created a Slovak state. Voloshyn's Carpatho-Ukraine, however, no choice was given to them. Instead, Hitler gave the green light to the Hungarians to attack Carpatho-Ukraine. And in the face of the advancing Hungarian army, the Carpatho-Ukrainian Diet proclaimed on March 15, 1939, its independence. But that very same day, the Hungarians reached the capital, Khust, and after encountering stiff resistance on the part of that Carpathian Sich, they managed to take over all of Carpatho-Ukraine in 3 days. Voloshyn's government was forced to flee. Many remaining Ukrainophile leaders or suspected sympathizers were arrested. And for the next 5.5 years, Transcarpathia was once again, as it had been before World War I, ruled by Hungary. This was considered by the Hungarians a major success. Finally, they got a real chunk of territory, not just a little bit. And the Hungarian government even made some promises about autonomy for this region under Hungarian rule, which they simply call Subcarpathia. But none of those promises were ever fulfilled. In terms of culture, the Ukrainophile national orientation, all of its cultural organizations and publications were banned. And while the Hungarian government favored the idea that Transcarpathians comprised a distinct pro-Hungarian Rusin, or they called it Hungarian Rusin, Ugro-Rusin nationality. In fact, its real goal was eventually to revive the pre-World War I policy of assimilation. And so, the first territorial change since World War I, which provoked armed conflict in Europe, so this is the first armed conflict in Europe, small as it was, actually occurred on territory within present-day Ukraine, specifically in Transcarpathia in March 1939. But that military clash was limited, contained within the region itself. 6 months later, in September 1939, Hitler's next move against Poland led to different results: armed resistance and the outbreak of World War II. So having finished with Czechoslovakia, in March 1939, Hitler turned his attention to Poland, and from that time on, ramped up his rhetoric and his speeches against the dastardly Poles. This time, however, Britain and France finally, took them time, realized how they had been duped at the Munich negotiations over Czechoslovakia. By the way, those negotiations in Munich ever since have become the symbol of appeasement or capitulation in the face of external threats, hoping that somehow we can avoid those eternal threats. So the idea of appeasement, which is well known and continually repeated, it goes back to this Munich Pact and the destruction of Czechoslovakia. But now France and Britain vowed that they would stand by their other Central European ally, Poland, should it be attacked by Germany. Now, Poland's situation was even more tenuous because, as you can see, it was bordered not only on Germany, but in the east by the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union itself. Stalin was becoming increasingly anxious about Germany's moves in Central and Eastern Europe. And so Stalin would welcome some kind of agreement with Germany. Now, for its part, Hitler's Germany had always considered Bolshevism an anathema, detested the Bolsheviks. In fact, during the 1930s, the Nazis had, in fact, systematically annihilated the formerly strong German communist movement. But a solution to the now Polish question seemed to have more importance at the moment. And so both Stalin and Hitler put ideology aside, did a diplomatic about-face, and approved the signing between August 19 and 23, 1939, almost 1 year, just a little under 1 year after the Munich Pact. Now we have a non-aggression treaty between the Soviet Union and Nazi Germany, known as the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact, named after the foreign ministers of each of the countries. This German-Soviet treaty provided for 3 items: a trade agreement, including a 2-year German credit to the Soviets for 180 million marks. So now the Germans were giving money to the Soviet Union. A 10-year non-aggression pact. For 10 years, there should be no conflict, military, between these two states. And then third, there was a secret clause providing for a demarcation line between the Allies, just in case at any point war might break out. So they wouldn't have any problem. So they created this demarcation line, which is on this map here. Goes down the Bug River, and it's almost similar to the present-day boundary between Poland and also Belarus and Ukraine. And by the way, during this whole period, now Soviet newspapers are filled with pictures of their new ally, Adolf Hitler, and how wonderful Nazi Germany is. Hitler, of course, had already formulated plans for an attack on Poland. Now, assured of Soviet neutrality, the German army was launched on September 1st, 1939, carrying out its first full-scale military operation, a lightning attack known as the Blitzkrieg. Quick shock, a blitz, which is lightning actually in German. So it's a lightning war, a lightning attack. Not only the troops on the ground, Air Force, naval attacks, and they descend on Poland. Britain and France actually did honor their pledges to their Central European ally, and so both Britain and France declared war on Germany on September 3rd. World War II had begun, although their declaration of war had no effect on Hitler's military operations, because it was a lightning attack. And despite heroic efforts at defense, Polish armies were sorely outnumbered in troops and outmatched in military equipment. So that within 3 weeks, Poland was brought to its knees. And as in the late 18th century, Poland now again ceased to exist. The German successes from the West made possible a Soviet advance from the East. Soviets kind of waited for the Germans to do their work, and then they come in from the East, beginning on September 17. By that time, they met with little or no Polish resistance. As a result of that the Soviet Red Army was able to take over most Belarusian and Ukrainian inhabited lands in the eastern part of Poland, the old Kresy, and from their perspective, reunite them with their respective Soviet Belarusian and Soviet Ukrainian motherlands. According to a new agreement on German-Soviet spheres of influence, following that demarcation, secret demarcation line in the Molotov-Ribbentrop pact, which now became real, Ukrainian territory east of that demarcation line became part of Soviet Ukraine, while Ukrainian inhabited territory to the west of the line, only small areas of the Chelm region and Podlachia, also the Lemko region in the south, they became part of something known as the Generalgouvernement Poland. Weird situation in which the Germans use a French kind of formula to describe this area of Poland that was now a part of Nazi Germany. So that's west of the demarcation line. East of the demarcation line, on those territories held by Soviet troops, what does one do? Well, we have elections. And on October 22nd, 1939, there are elections from a prepared list of acceptable candidates to gather at a National Assembly of Western Ukraine. And 4 days later, under the protection of the Red Army, this assembly, in fact, did meet, and it requested that Western Ukraine be annexed to the Soviet Union. Of course, the request was sent to Moscow. There was some deliberation. Should they accept this? And guess what? On November 1st, 1939, the request was approved by the Soviet government in Moscow, which assigned Western Ukraine to the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. During the following summer of 1940, while Hitler was preoccupied with the war in Western Europe, attacking France, Stalin consolidated further control over what was now considered the Soviet sphere of influence in Central and Eastern Europe, as outlined in those secret clauses of the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact. And so, in June 1940, Soviet Union annexes the 3 Baltic provinces. And so, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania as independent states cease to exist. Soviets march into northern Bukovina, that had been part of Romania, annex it. And then also the eastern part of Romania, Bessarabia, was now joined with the Moldavian Soviet Socialist, or Autonomous Soviet Republic within Soviet Ukraine. Now, in all these new territories annexed to the Soviet Ukraine, the Soviet system of government and economic organization quickly implemented. In Western Ukraine, 6 new oblasts, which is the dividing thing, the administrative division, like regions. 6 new oblasts were created. Industry and trade was nationalized. Land divided among the poor peasants. Although by 1940, the establishment of the first state farms and voluntary collective farms were coming into being. Now, while both the Orthodox and important Greek Catholic Church, at least in Galicia, were left intact, religious instruction was removed from schools, church land confiscated, and there were some initial efforts undertaken to convert Greek Catholic churches into Orthodox churches. Other Ukrainian institutions from interwar Poland, of course many of them going back to the Austrian times, fared much worse. All former political parties, cultural institutions, including the Prosvita Society and the Shevchenko Scientific Society, those cooperatives that were so important, newspapers, all of these were now abolished. Several Ukrainian leaders who had not already fled westward across the demarcation line into the German-controlled Generalgouvernement, and that included leaders of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, any that were left behind were arrested. Now, on the other hand, the new Soviet Ukrainian government did institute a policy of Ukrainianization. You remember Ukrainianization that we discussed at its height in the 1920s, before it was dismantled in the 1930s, but now we have new territory, so we now introduce it again. And one aspect of this policy of Ukrainianization, in a sense, took the form of de-Polonization. Well, what did that mean? Large numbers of Poles were arrested, deported to Siberia, and other parts of Soviet Central Asia. In particular, all of the Poles who had come to Eastern Galicia after 1919, after it became the Polish state, because they were considered newcomers. So these are the ones that were picked up and deported to the east. Another aspect of Ukrainianization dealt with culture and education. All Polish cultural institutions in Lviv and other eastern Galician towns and cities were abolished. The Polish Jan Kazimir University of Lviv was renamed the Ivan Franko University, which still carries that name today. Ivan Franko was the outstanding late 19th century Ukrainian writer. And that university was now transformed into a Ukrainian language institution. A branch of the Ukrainian Academy of Sciences was established in the city. Elementary and secondary schools were Ukrainianized, leaving Polish schools only in purely Polish areas. Similarly, in most schools in northern Bukovina and in Bessarabia, those territories that were part of Romania, Ukrainian now replaced Romanian during the 1940-41 school year. Now, west of that demarcation line, that is, within the German-ruled General Gouvernement, the local Ruthenian Ukrainian population in this Chelm region, part of Podlachia, and the Lemko region in western Galicia, if you will. They were soon dominated by the more than 20,000 refugees that had come from the east, these Ukrainian refugees that were fleeing Soviet rule. The Germans actually permitted the establishment of Ukrainian language schools. Also, a relief organization known as the Ukrainian Central Committee was set up in Krakow. And finally, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, that body that had fought against an underground war against Polish rule throughout the 1930s. It was permitted to exist in German-controlled General Gouvernement Poland. But the effectiveness of this OUN, the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, was lessened considerably. Why? Because of internal conflicts. They began to take shape in the summer of 1940 and were finalized the following spring with the creation of two antagonistic factions of the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists, the OUN-M, named after the leader of the organization, Andriy Melnyk, and the OUN-B by a younger group who disagreed with the leadership of Melnyk, led by a man named Stepan Bandera, who was imprisoned under the Poles and then was released. Both these supporters of the so-called Melnykites and the so-called Banderites fought with each other in an attempt to seize and dominate the leadership of the OUN. And this factional strife within the ranks, as well as all Ukrainian life, whether in the German-controlled General Gouvernement to the west of the demarcation line, or the Soviet-ruled Ukraine east of the demarcation line, all of these matters were soon to be overwhelmed completely by an entirely new development: Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union. And it is to that that we shall turn when we return.